Hello, my name is Madison Marshall, and today I will be conducting a presentation on the overpopulation of Indigenous peoples in Canadian penitentiaries. This presentation will be based on the news article by Aboriginal Peoples Television Network, also known as APTN News. The article that this presentation is based on is titled "It's Disappointing. Corrections Maintain Status Quo as Numbers of Indigenous Women Tops 40% of Prison Population." Looking at colonial influences, a Deputy Commissioner for Indigenous Corrections role, statistics, and Gladue reports, this presentation will exemplify the historical and current events that led to the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in the Canadian legal system. This presentation will be separated into four main sections. The first section will use the APTN news article to explain the importance of providing a Deputy Commissioner role for Indigenous peoples. This section will also focus on how this role could help accurately represent Indigenous peoples in the system. The second portion of this presentation will focus on why this role is needed, using statistics from the news article to exemplify this point. The third section of this presentation will look at the colonial influences, specifically residential schools and the 60s scoop, that contributed to the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in the criminal justice system today. Finally, this presentation will focus on the legal perspective of this issue and use Gladue reports to exemplify how these legal documents are essential to providing accurate context and perspective to Indigenous sentencing. The Deputy Commissioner for Indigenous Corrections role is very important to dismantling the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in the Canadian criminal justice system. This role, as explained by Blackburn, would serve the interest of Indigenous peoples by focusing on Indigenous issues and needs both in court and in jail. This role would ensure that Indigenous perspective and presence was heard and acknowledged in correctional decision-making. The Correctional Service of Canada, or CSC, has denied this position in the past and continues to resist the development of this new commissioner role. The CSC defends their position by stating that their current governance structure is adequate to serving the high number of Indigenous peoples locked away in Canada's penitentiaries, particularly women who now make up more than 40% of the female population in prison. The CSC believe that their senior deputy commissioner provides enough leadership required to improve and sustain correctional results for Indigenous offenders, despite this person having no Indigenous background. This is a major concern as the current commissioner role will not understand the specific Indigenous issues, histories, or current trauma that are connected to the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in the criminal justice system. As discussed in the Criminal Justice Issues Part 1 video, Aboriginal peoples make up about 3% of the total population, but contribute to almost 20% of the total inmate population in Canada. More statistics from the APTN news article also depict this point. According to the article, since 2010, the federal inmate population has increased by 1.2% for non-Indigenous peoples, but for Indigenous populations, there has been a 52.1% increase in federal inmate populations. Focusing specifically on Indigenous women, this problem only seems to be worse. Over the last 10 years, the federally sentenced women inmate population has increased by 34.8%, while the Indigenous population has increased by 73.8%. These statistics exemplify the absurd disproportion of Indigenous peoples in Canadian prisons. As sentencing practices and legislators were developed to address inmates who are white and male, they often do not take into consideration Indigenous experiences. The issues are not solely seen in the amount of Indigenous inmates, but also in the treatment of Indigenous inmates. As the article states, Indigenous inmates are more likely to spend the most time in segregation, are more likely to be classified as maximum security, are more likely to be released later in their sentences, and when they do get out, they are more likely to have their parole revoked. Most of these statistics and events are occurring due to the institutional racism that exists in the system, as well as a lack of Indigenous understanding and history. There needs to be more people in the system that understand Indigenous history and experiences. This new commissioner role will specifically help these inmates that are being discriminated against and overrepresented. As the article states, along with the Indigenous Deputy Commissioner role, a clear commitment to significantly reallocate and transfer responsibilities to Indigenous communities for the care, custody, and supervision of Indigenous offenders would go a long way to address the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Residential schools have a major impact on the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in the criminal justice system. The main focus of residential schools was to integrate Indigenous children into the European Canadian society. These schools were run by the Catholic Church and taught the children European Canadian traditions and education. These children were not allowed to speak their Indigenous language, dress in their traditional clothing, and learn or practice their Indigenous culture.
The 60s scoop was another devastating event for Indigenous peoples. During the 1960s, Indigenous children were taken away from their families and placed into foster homes, where they were adopted and raised by white families in Canada. Similarly to the children that attended residential schools, these children lost their language, Indigenous names, attachment to their culture, and specifically their spiritual connection to their traditional lands. At residential schools across Canada, these students suffered many different kinds of abuse, including physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. As a result of these types of abuse, many survivors experience PTSD and use unhealthy coping mechanisms. These coping mechanisms can include substance abuse or addiction, self-harm or harm to others, dissociation, and risk-taking. These are all behaviors that make one more likely to end up in the criminal justice system. As these children were rarely or sometimes never able to spend time with their families, many never learned the strategies needed to become loving parents or partners. When these survivors did become parents or spouses, they would not have the skills to interact with others appropriately, leading the abuse and neglect they experienced in residential schools to resurface in their own relationships, once again leading to criminal behavior. As a result of the devastating experiences of the 60s scoop, these children would use negative coping mechanisms discussed above and would face the same negative consequences, leaving them more likely to be involved in the criminal justice system. Looking forward, the introduction of Gladue reports seeks to provide Indigenous context and background in both bail and sentencing hearings. These reports include colonial oppressions that Indigenous peoples experienced that may have led to the crime committed. These reports include recommendations that emphasize Indigenous healing rather than incarceration and focus on the rehabilitation of Indigenous peoples. Gladue reports and Gladue courts, in which judges are trained in the appropriate use of Gladue reports and the consideration of Aboriginal offenders' background, both help to dismantle the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in Canadian penitentiaries.